Thanks. Thank you for that anecdote. And actually, yeah, I'll just say, I remember especially a young Syrian woman standing up, Sarah, I think her name is, and talking about her perspective on what I had said. And what she had to say is basically what I've heard wherever I've given talks, or sometimes periodically I get these messages on Facebook from Syrians saying, thank you, we've been saying this for years, but nobody will listen to us. In New Jersey, in December 2016, I had a Syrian doctor who, at a panel similar to this, who broke down in tears, crying, because he'd been trying to convince people about the reality of what's really happening in Syria, and said, people just won't listen. And so I'm so sorry to all the Syrians that have been trying to get their voices heard, not just Syrians, but everybody who's waging a struggle to get their truth heard and are being ignored. And so I will do my utmost, and I always try to do my utmost, to deliver their words and their experiences to you here. But today I'm actually going to be focusing more on the media aspect and how media is controlling the narratives. It's not presenting the news. It's literally creating narratives that enable the imperialist wars and occupations around the world. And my focus will be mainly on Syria. But with that said, I do want to touch just very briefly on Palestine. And I'm sure with this audience I don't really need to say the obvious, but obviously the way corporate media describes events in occupied Palestine, particularly in Gaza, is a perfect example of how this colonial media functions. Now, having lived in Gaza for 3 years, between the period of November 2008 and March 2013, I participated in many nonviolent protests along the border. Protests where people were calling for basic human rights from their occupier, and where they're calling for their farmers to be able to access their land without being literally gunned down by the Israeli army. And these protests were always met with either with gunfire right away, or a mixture of gunfire, tear gas, and the same thing would happen just simply as I just referred to when farmers would go on their land. And yet the corporate media now, if you've been following events in Gaza, people have been gunned down, and the Israeli army does not discriminate between gender or age or profession. So you have medics and nurses and journalists being gunned down, you have children, you have elderly, and the way the corporate media describes this is clashes. So you could understand why a working person here who isn't very in tune with real news from Palestine, Syria, or elsewhere, would be confused and would wonder why those Palestinians keep, making Israel defend themselves by slaughtering unarmed protesters. But actually I wrote something not long ago on this issue of unarmed protesters. Now, what the corporate narrative on Syria has been, in a nutshell, was that in early 2011, Syrians were fed up with their government. All over the country rose up, and then the brutal government started cracking down and slaughtering them. So when the issue of unarmed protesters pertains to Syria, and I'll clarify that narrative in one moment, then the Western corporate media, and the Gulf media of course, is very keen to talk about unarmed protesters. But when there are actual unarmed protesters in Gaza, we don't hear about them. They are security risks to the Israeli defense forces, and defense is absolutely the last word you can use for that entity. I'd like to quote from the amazing veteran journalist John Pilger. And what I want to quote him on is on how this type of media came to be. Now he began, he cited Edward Bernays, and he was citing how journalism used to be, and then he basically said, and then this new thing called professional journalism was introduced. And so basically to attract the advertisers, the new corporate press had to appear respectable, pillars of the establishment, objective, impartial, and balanced. And these are all words that I have slung at me on a routine basis, because I'm not impartial. I'm very partial. I'm against the bloodshed. I'm against the wars against these nations that will not bow to the imperialists. So he went on to say, so the right to freedom of expression was associated with the new media, but the whole thing, this whole new journalism, was entirely bogus. For what the public didn't know was that in order to be professional, journalists had to ensure that news and opinion were dominated by official sources. And this is so true when we look at the case of Syria. So with Syria, there are many forms of propaganda that have been used over and over and over throughout the years since 2011. And basically, the main components are, you have to, the Western nations that want to overthrow Syria's president, Bashar al-Assad, use these tactics, not just in Syria, but in nations they want to topple, and that is you have to demonize the leader, romanticize the opposition, so-called opposition, and what was that third point? Oh yeah, well then you have to attack anybody who dares to question the official narrative. So this has most definitely been happening in Syria. Now if you look at reports on Syria prior to 2011, you will find that the tone of the reporting to do with President Assad and the First Lady was entirely different. They called him a revolutionary, they said he was opening up Syria and developing the economy, and the First Lady was wonderful, and there was a whole article in Vogue with the First Lady, the Rose in the Desert, or something like that. Well, my personal opinion, this is irrespective of my reporting, is that she is wonderful, and she's doing wonderful things for her country, and the president is beloved. But that is not the thesis of my presentation, but it has to be said. The Syrian people chose their president, they love their president, and what's happened in Syria isn't about him, at least from the perspective of the Syrian people. It is about him from the perspective of the imperialist nations that want him gone, because Syria did not bow down to their demands to stop supporting Palestinian and Lebanese resistance, to allow these big multinational corporations and banking systems in their country. There were a number of demands that were posed to Syria, and I'm sure that Christopher Black, who spoke earlier, could probably articulate them much more eloquently. But the main thing is that Syria resisted this project to install a puppet government in their country. This project has been in the making for years and years, if not decades, prior to 2011. I said I would get back to the issue of the 2011 protest. Now, I can't spend a whole lot of time on it due to the time limitations, but I will say I have spoken to enough Syrians, both in Canada and Toronto, and Syrians in Syria, around the country, one-on-one, speaking with them, sometimes in English, sometimes in Arabic, and they swear that the protests were not initially peaceful. Yes, there were people that went out. I had many friends tell me, yeah, I saw protests and I joined because I want political change in my country. But then I saw that these were sectarian and these were violent. And I didn't want that kind of change. I didn't want that for my country. What kind of revolution destroys its own country? And I've heard this time and time again. And there's a number of articles I would recommend. Stephen Gowan's, what's that article he wrote called? Stephen Gowans has a wonderful article on this, the revolutionary distemper that wasn't. Fantastic article, I highly recommend that. Sharmeen Narwani, Stephen Gowans, G-O-W-A-N-S. Yeah, it's a fantastic article. He's also written a number of books on Syria, also I believe on North Korea. And Sharmeen Narwani, I really suggest you read her writings because she wrote an article called The Hidden Massacre, detailing the massacres that were occurring in March and April 2011, at the time when corporate media was telling all the world that the Syrian regime was gunning down unarmed protesters. And finally, on the note of this theme, I've been to Dara twice now. I went in May and I went in September this year. And when I went in May, Dara was still partially occupied by Al-Qaeda and other terrorists. And so it was dangerous for the people living there. It was dangerous to go to the state hospital because there were literally snipers 100 meters away. However, Dara is also the quote-unquote birthplace of the revolution. And so in Dara, I spoke with people, civilians, I spoke with a priest, and I have his testimony on my YouTube channel saying, no, no, no. We used to see protesters coming in from the countryside, riding on motorcycles with their weapons beneath them, and then go and attack government buildings. So my friend and colleague Mark Taliano is in the audience, and I would really encourage you to read his book and his articles, because he's also detailed, at least in his articles, I'm not sure about the book yet, that this has all been a conspiracy against Syria, and the notion of protest being unarmed and peaceful is completely bogus. However, back to the media. So I mentioned there have been a number of different propaganda tactics used over the years regarding Syria. Let's remember in 2016, before the city of Aleppo in Syria's north was liberated of Al-Qaeda and the child beheaders of Nuruddin al-Zinki, and the mishmash of other extremist terrorists that were occupying eastern and other areas of the city for years, before that, there was a campaign of war propaganda, which said things like, there are no doctors in Aleppo, or the hospitals are being destroyed in Aleppo. In July of 2016, I took a taxi at my own expense and I went to the Aleppo Medical Association. They said, we have over 4,000 doctors, and 800 of them are specialists. Because also around this time, when you heard about the last doctor or no doctors, they were saying, well, here's the last pediatrician. And this was one of the propaganda themes, was the last this, the last even cat or clown or absurd things. But then when Aleppo was being liberated, and people were coming out of the corridors, finally freed of the terrorist rule they'd been enduring for years, our media was saying Aleppo was falling. And I'm not aware of any CBC journalist or any other corporate media who has bothered to go back to Aleppo now and see how it fell, and see how there's life anew in the streets, and cafes and shops have reopened, and 800,000 or more people came back. And one other thing they misled us on, well, they didn't mention that Greater Aleppo was being bombarded by terrorists on a daily basis, and people there were being sniped by terrorists on a daily basis. 11,000 civilians alone, not including army, 11,000 civilians alone were killed by terrorist bombings and snipings, and our media was not talking about this. With regard to Aleppo, I just want to mention one of the chief propagandists in the UK, that is Channel 4, but one of their star propagandists is a man named Krishnan Gurumurthy. Now, he's guilty of some of the worst war propaganda on Syria. However, he went back to Aleppo in July 2017 and interviewed a man named Farish Shahabi, who was a member of parliament. And when Farish brought up the point that